close your eyes and drift into the whispering forest where silence reigns under a frost that shouldn't exist. Follow Kale, an elven warrior, as he journeys through frozen lands to the frosted moor. There, in a glimmering tower of ice, awaits Silra, the enigmatic winter witch. Together they face an ancient spirit of frost and shadow to save the forest from eternal winter. Let the quiet chill and the magic of their story guide you into a peaceful sleep. Kale strode through the once vibrant heart of the whispering forest, his boots crunching over a layer of frost that had no right to exist. The trees around him, their leaves now encased in shimmering ice, groaned under the weight of their frozen shrouds. It was a silence unlike any he had known. No birdsong, no rustling of leaves. Even the streams, which had always sung their way through the forest, were now silent ribbons of ice. He paused at the base of an ancient oak, its roots tangled like the gnarled hands of an elder. A single blossom, caught mid-bloom, lay suspended in frost, a cruel mockery of the life the forest once teemed with. Kale knelt, running a gloved hand over the icy petals, and felt an unnatural chill seep through the leather. This was no ordinary winter. Rising, Cole tightened his cloak around his shoulders and continued deeper into the forest, his thoughts heavy. His people, the forest elves, were attuned to the rhythm of the seasons. Winter was no stranger to them, but this frost was alien. It crept where no winter should, seizing life with a coldness that seemed to gnaw at the very essence of the forest. Weeks had passed since the frost began its relentless advance, and the elders' attempts to halt it had all failed. Rituals, chants, even the magic of their strongest spellcasters had proven useless. Now, the whispers of a forgotten prophecy had surfaced, a tale buried in the dust of ancient scrolls. Kale had not believed it at first. Prophecies, after all, were the stuff of stories told to wide-eyed children. Yet, as the frost reached the sacred glade, where the elves held their most powerful ceremonies, doubt gave way to grim acceptance. The scroll he had found spoke of a curse tied to an entity older than the forest itself, a being of ice and shadow. And at the heart of it all, a name, Silra, the Winter Witch. The very idea had caused an uproar in the council. No elf had dared approach the frosted moor in centuries, not since the witch's name became synonymous with dread. But Kale knew that waiting was no longer an option. If the frost continued its march, the forest would not survive the winter, and so he had volunteered. The forest grew darker as Kale pressed on. The air itself seemed heavier, colder, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. His hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his blade, a finely wrought weapon of silver and runes, a gift from his mother before her passing. It had seen many battles, though none like the one he suspected awaited him. At last, he reached the entrance to the archives, hidden beneath the roots of the oldest tree in the forest. Torches lit themselves as Coil descended into the earthy depths, their flickering light casting strange shadows on the walls. The scroll he sought lay where he had left it, sealed in a case of crystal to preserve its fragile parchment. Cale opened it carefully, the elven runes etched into the scroll seeming to shimmer with a life of their own. The prophecy was written in the lyrical cadence of Old Elven, a language he had struggled to master as a child. Yet its meaning was clear. When frost claims the life of the green, seek the one who bears the chill. For only the hand of ice may mend what the cold has broken. His breath frosted in the air as he read the words aloud. The witch's domain lay at the edge of the forest, where no elf dared tread. If the scroll was to be believed, she alone held the key to stopping the frost. But what price might she demand for her aid? Kyle replaced the scroll and turned to leave the archives, the weight of its words heavy on his shoulders. Outside, snow had begun to fall, a rare sight in these parts. Yet the snow carried no beauty, only a sense of foreboding, as though the forest itself was mourning its fate. As he set off toward the frosted moor, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a story much larger than himself. The forest's fate hung in the balance, and the path ahead was cloaked in uncertainty. Yet one thing was certain. He would face whatever lay ahead, even if it meant bargaining with the witch, whose name was etched in the fears of his people. The frost whispered around him, a warning and a challenge. Cale tightened his grip on his blade and walked on. The frosted moor stretched before Cale, an expanse of ghostly white and shimmering blue that seemed to swallow sound itself. The air was sharp, biting at his exposed skin like unseen teeth. His breaths emerged in clouds of mist, disappearing as quickly as they formed. Around him, the landscape was alien. Ice-covered rocks jutted from the ground like jagged teeth, and the ground beneath his boots was slick with frost. Even the sky above seemed muted, its pale grey expanse offering no hint of warmth or light. Kyle paused at the edge of the moor, his instincts urging him to turn back. The tales of the Winter Witch, Silra, had been enough to frighten even the bravest elves. She was said to command storms, to weave spells of frost that could turn entire armies to ice. But it wasn't just her magic that made her fearsome. It was the aura of mystery that surrounded her. No one who sought her had ever returned. Their fates whispered about in hushed tones around elven fires. He gripped the hilt of his blade, its familiar weight grounding him, and stepped forward. The ice cracked beneath his boots with every step, the sound echoing across the moor like the breaking of fragile glass. The deeper he ventured, the more the cold seemed to seep into his very bones, as though the moor itself resented his presence. After what felt like hours, he saw it. A lone structure rising out of the frost. It was unlike anything Kyle had seen before. A tower of ice, its spires twisting unnaturally toward the sky. The surface shimmered with an otherworldly light, as though the tower contained its own hidden stars. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. A creation that could only belong to one being. Kale approached cautiously, his breath catching as he noticed movement in the icy walls. Shadows shifted within, humanoid forms that seemed trapped just beneath the surface. Were they prisoners? Spirits? He did not know, and he dared not linger to find out. The great doors of the tower, made of a translucent, glossy ice, creaked open as if sensing his arrival. Kyle hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he had come too far. His people's survival depended on this meeting. He stepped inside. The air within the tower was colder still, yet strangely still. Frost coated the walls, forming intricate patterns that seemed to pulse faintly with light. The room was vast and empty, save for a single figure standing at its center. Silra, the winter witch, was as haunting as the tales had described. Her hair was silver white, cascading down her back like frozen waterfalls. Her eyes were crystalline blue, cold and sharp as daggers, and her skin was pale, almost translucent, as though she were carved from ice herself. She wore a cloak of shimmering frost that billowed gently, though no wind stirred the air. "You've come far," she said, her voice soft, yet carrying an edge of steel. Few dare to cross the moor. Fewer still are foolish enough to enter my domain. Kyle drew himself up, ignoring the chill that seemed to press down on him from all sides. "Silra," he said, his voice steady. "The forest is dying. An unnatural frost spreads through it, and no magic we possess can stop it. The scrolls speak of a curse and name you as the one who can break it." Silra's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "The forest suffers, does it?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. How ironic. Her words sent a chill through Kyle's spine, colder than any frost. "You deny your involvement," he pressed. "Are you not the Winter Witch?" Her gaze sharpened, and the air around her seemed to drop several degrees. "I am," she said, "but I am no villain of your stories, elf. This curse you speak of is not my doing. It is the work of the ancient spirit of winter, an entity older and far more dangerous than I." Kyle frowned, his grip tightening on his blade. "Then you know how to stop it." Silra tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see straight through him. "Perhaps I do. But tell me, warrior, why should I help you? Your kind has long avoided my domain, whispering of me as though I were a monster. What loyalty do I owe to your forest?" Kyle met her gaze, his voice firm. "Because if the forest falls, so will everything else. Even this more. For a moment, Silra said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she laughed, a sound like the crackling of ice. "Very well," she said, her voice carrying a note of reluctant amusement. "If you wish to stop the spirit, you will need me. But be warned, elf. This is no simple quest. The spirit is wrathful, and its power far exceeds mine. To confront it is to court death." Kyle nodded, his resolve unshaken. "Then we will face it together." Silra's smile returned, colder and sharper than ever. Together indeed. Kale and Silra journeyed into the depths of the frosted moor, their path marked by an uneasy alliance. The bitter cold was relentless, gnawing at Kyle's endurance despite his cloak and layered armor. Silra, however, seemed unaffected, her presence an extension of the icy landscape they traversed. She moved with a quiet grace, her frosted cloak trailing behind her like a whisper of winter itself. The journey was fraught with perils from the outset. The moor was alive in its desolation, as though the land itself sought to impede their progress. Frozen wolves, their eyes gleaming like shards of amber, emerged from the mist, their growls a low rumble that vibrated through the icy ground. Silra raised a hand, her fingers tracing intricate patterns in the air. A frost-laden wind surged forward, scattering the pack before they could attack. Yet her magic left behind an unnatural stillness, a reminder of the forces she commanded. "Does your magic always quiet the land like this?" Kyle asked, his voice low as they pressed onward. Silra cast him a sidelong glance, her expression unreadable. "Magic takes," she replied simply. "Even when it gives." Kyle let the words hang in the frigid air. Despite her enigmatic nature, he began to see glimpses of humanity in Silra, or what had once been humanity. She spoke little of herself, and when she did, it was with a detachment that unnerved him. Yet there was a sorrow beneath her icy exterior, one that Kyle couldn't ignore. Their path led them through treacherous terrain, fields of brittle ice that cracked underfoot, crevasses that seemed to appear without warning, and groves of frozen trees whose branches creaked like lamenting spirits. Each step brought them closer to the heart of the forest, where the winter spirit's presence grew ever stronger. The frost thickened, clinging to their clothes and hair, and the air became so cold that even Kale's breath froze in delicate patterns before falling to the ground like shattered glass. As they neared the spirit's domain, Silra began to change. Her movements grew slower, as though she were carrying an invisible burden. Kale noticed the faint tremor in her hands and the way her breath came heavier, despite her apparent immunity to the cold. "What's wrong?" he asked, breaking their long silence. "The spirit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Its power grows as we approach. It senses us." Kale frowned, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his blade. Then we're close. Silra stopped, turning to face him. You don't understand, she said, her crystalline eyes piercing his. The spirit is not merely a creature. It is a force, a manifestation of the winter itself. It knows our intentions, and it will not allow us to reach it without a fight. Before Kale could respond, the ground beneath them shook violently. The frozen landscape groaned and cracked, and from the fissures emerged tendrils of frost, twisting and writhing like serpents. They lashed out with a will of their own, forcing Kyle to draw his blade. The runes along the silver edge glowed faintly, their warmth a stark contrast to the biting cold. Silra stepped forward, her hands weaving a barrier of frost that shimmered like glass. "Keep moving," she called out, her voice sharp with command. "The spirit is testing us." Cashel nodded, cutting through the frost tendrils as they lunged at him. His blade moved with precision, the runes blazing brighter with every strike. Beside him, Silra's magic surged, her movements a deadly dance of ice and power. Together they fought their way through the spirit's defenses, their breaths mingling in the frozen air like ghosts. At last, the tendrils receded, leaving the land eerily quiet once more. Silra leaned against a nearby tree, her expression pale and drawn. Kyle sheathed his blade and stepped closer, his concern overriding his caution. "You're hurt," he said, noting the faint cracks of frost creeping up her arms. "It's nothing," she replied, though her voice wavered. "The spirit is drawing on my magic. It knows I'm a threat." Kyle hesitated before placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll face it together, as we agreed." Silra looked at him for a long moment, her icy facade softening ever so slightly. "You're more stubborn than I expected, elf." Kyle allowed himself a faint smile. "I've been told as much." They pressed on, their resolve unbroken, despite the mounting dangers. As they climbed the final ridge, the land gave way to a vast frozen lake. At its center stood an altar of jagged ice, glowing faintly with an otherworldly blue light. The air around it was heavy with power, so cold it burned. Silra's voice was barely audible over the rising wind. "We've found it! The spirit's sanctuary!" Kyle tightened his grip on his blade. The frost around the altar shimmered, and a figure began to take shape within its glow. A towering entity of frost and shadow, its eyes gleaming with ancient wrath. The hunt was over. The battle was about to begin. The wind howled across the frozen lake, carrying a biting chill that cut through Kyle's armor and Silra's frost cloak alike. The towering figure at the altar of ice solidified into the form of the winter spirit. A massive being with jagged, frost-covered limbs and eyes that burned with an eerie cold fire. Its breath emerged as swirling clouds of ice crystals, and when it moved, the frozen lake beneath them groaned in protest. Kale and Silra stood side by side, their breath mingling in frosted clouds. The spirit regarded them with a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from the ice itself. "You dare disturb my sanctuary," it rumbled, the sound reverberating through the frozen expanse. "Mortals, you have trespassed where you do not belong." Kyle stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "Your frost is killing the forest," he said, his voice steady despite the cold gnawing at him. "We've come to end this." The spirit's laughter echoed like the crackling of icebergs splitting. "And this? It was your kind who broke the ancient pact, who desecrated my sacred grove. The frost is my vengeance, and it will not cease until your forest does no more." Silra raised a hand, her fingers trembling with effort as she summoned a swirl of icy light. "The pact may have been broken," she said, her voice sharp, "but it is not the forest's fault. It is your wrath that has poisoned the land. If you refuse to relent, we will stop you by force." The spirit's eyes flared, and the temperature around them plummeted. Shards of ice shot forth from its body, lancing toward them like spears. Kyle's blade flashed, deflecting the shards as he lunged forward, the runes along the blade glowing with a warm golden light. Silra chanted under her breath, her magic weaving a protective barrier of frost around them. The spirit roared, raising a massive arm to strike. Kale darted to the side, his blade carving into the frozen limb with a sharp crack. Ice splintered, but reformed almost instantly, the spirit's power unyielding. "Silra!" Kale called out, dodging another strike. "We need to weaken it." "I know," she snapped, her voice strained. She extended her arms, summoning a fiery spell that erupted in a wave of shimmering blue flames. The flames licked at the spirit's form, melting chunks of ice and forcing it to retreat momentarily. But the effort cost Silra dearly. Kyle saw her stagger, frost creeping up her arms as if the spirit's wrath was leeching her strength. The spirit retaliated with a blast of freezing wind, knocking Kale off his feet. He slid across the frozen lake, his blade skittering out of reach. Before he could rise, the spirit loomed over him, its icy claws poised to strike. A surge of light burst from Silra's hands, enveloping the spirit in a cage of frost fire. "Kyle!" she shouted. "Get up!" Kyle scrambled to his feet, reclaiming his blade as the spirit struggled against Silra's magic. He could see the strain in her eyes, the cracks of frost now spreading across her face. Her power was faltering, but she held on. Kyle charged, his blade blazing with runic light. He leapt onto the spirit's back, driving his sword into the icy core at its center. The spirit howled, its form flickering as cracks spread across its body like a spiderweb. Silra unleashed another wave of frostfire, the blue flames consuming the spirit's limbs and reducing them to mist. The spirit let out a final deafening roar before it collapsed into a torrent of ice and snow. The frozen lake shook violently, fissures spreading across its surface. Kyle jumped back, landing beside Silra as the spirit's form dissolved into nothingness. For a moment, all was still. Kyle turned to Silra, who swayed unsteadily on her feet. The frost that had crept up her arms and face began to fade, but her strength was clearly spent. He caught her as she stumbled, her body cold to the touch. "It's over," he said, his voice low. Silra shook her head weakly. "Not yet," she whispered. "The spirit's power is broken, but its wrath remains. We must restore the grove, or the frost will return." Kale nodded, his resolve firm. Together they turned their gaze toward the horizon where the sacred grove awaited, hidden, yet vital to the forest's survival. The battle had been won, but the cost of victory was still to be measured. The final trial lay ahead. The sacred grove was shrouded in mist, its boundaries marked by ancient trees encased in frost. The air was heavy with an unearthly stillness, as if the grove itself held its breath. Kale and Silra stood at its edge, the toll of their battle evident in their wearied forms. Kale's armor bore the scars of the spirit's icy wrath, and Silra leaned heavily on a staff of frost she had conjured from the remnants of her power. The grove had been untouched by elven hands for centuries, a place of reverence long since forgotten. Now it lay dormant, its once vibrant magic buried beneath layers of ice. At its center, a withered tree rose from the frozen ground, its branches bare and twisted. This was the heart of the grove, the source of the ancient pact. Kale stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. "This is it," he said, his voice quiet. "The spirit's grudge began here." Silra nodded, her gaze fixed on the tree. "The pact was a promise," she murmured, her voice laced with a sorrow that felt as ancient as the grove itself. "A vow to protect this place, to ensure its magic remained untouched. But your kind broke that vow." Kyle turned to her, his expression shadowed with guilt. "Not all elves," he said, his voice firm. "The actions of the past cannot define us forever. We've come to make things right." Silra's crystalline eyes studied him for a moment, searching for something unspoken. Then, with a faint nod, she raised her staff. The air around her grew colder, and a soft, pale light began to emanate from the frost-covered ground. "The grove's magic is tied to the spirit," she explained, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Restoring it will require more than my power. The land must feel the sincerity of your oath." Kyle stepped closer to the tree, his breath clouding in the icy air. The runes on his blade glowed faintly, as though responding to the latent magic of the grove. He knelt before the withered tree, placing his sword at its base. "I, Kale of the Whispering Forest, swear on my honor and my blade," he said, his voice resonating through the grove. "I vow to protect this land and the magic it holds. No harm shall come to this grove while I draw breath. For a moment, nothing happened. The stillness of the grove deepened, the frost-laden branches above swaying faintly in an unseen breeze. Then a faint warmth spread through the air, melting the ice at the tree's base. The ground beneath Kyle's knees softened, and the withered tree shuddered as if awakening from a long slumber. Silra stepped forward, her staff glowing with a soft blue light. "The spirit's wrath lingers," she said, her voice low. "But your oath has rekindled the grove's magic. Together, we can restore the balance." She raised her staff, and Kale placed his hands on the trunk of the tree. A surge of energy coursed through him, ancient, raw, and unyielding. The frost that clung to the branches began to melt, droplets of water falling to the ground like tears. The tree's bark, once brittle and grey, turned a deep, vibrant green. Tiny buds appeared along its branches, unfolding into delicate blossoms that glowed softly in the dim light. As the grove came to life, a low hum filled the air, resonating through the earth and sky. The mist began to dissipate, revealing the grove in its renewed glory. The frost retreated, replaced by a shimmering carpet of moss and flowers. The air grew warmer, carrying the faint scent of new growth. Kale stepped back, his breath caught in his throat as he took in the transformation. "It's beautiful," he murmured. Silra lowered her staff, her expression softened by a rare smile. "The spirit has been appeased," she said. "Its grudge is no more." A faint light appeared above the tree, coalescing into a shape that resembled the spirit. But this time, its form was gentle, its eyes no longer burning with wrath. The spirit bowed its head to Kale and Silra, before dissolving into a cascade of light that spread across the grove, sealing the renewed pact. Kale turned to Silra. "What happens now?" Silra's smile faded, replaced by a distant look. "My role here is done," she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. "The spirit's wrath sustained my existence in the frosted moor. Without it, I fade." Kale stepped toward her, his expression resolute. "You don't have to. Stay. Help protect the grove." Silra shook her head, a faint laugh escaping her lips. "This is not my place, Kyle. My magic was born of frost and vengeance. The forest needs life, not shadows." Before Kale could respond, Silra's form began to dissolve, her frost cloak unraveling into the air. She looked at him one last time, her crystalline eyes soft. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she faded into the mist. Kyle stood alone in the grove, the weight of the renewed pact settling on his shoulders. He sheathed his blade and turned to leave, the forest around him alive with new life. The frost had lifted, and though the cost had been great, balance had been restored. The grove whispered its gratitude as Kyle departed, a quiet promise that its magic would endure.